In 1858, a man named Gale Borden patented a way to boil milk down into a thick syrup that could sit on a shelf for years without spoiling. Within 10 years, his factories were the largest of their kind in the world. Within 30 years, every major city in America had laws on the books forcing dairy farmers to deliver their milk through centralized processing plants. By 1910, raw milk, the same milk that had fed every human civilization for 10,000 years, was being called a public health hazard. But here is the part nobody talks about. The disease outbreaks they used to justify the laws happened in cities that were already pasteurizing their milk. The scientists they paid to write the studies were funded by the same families that owned the dairy trusts. And the small farms that fed neighborhoods with fresh raw milk for generations were not just shut down. They were destroyed, burned, condemned, and erased from the public record so completely that most Americans today do not even know they existed. This is not a story about milk. This is a story about the quiet replacement of an entire way of life. And the more you look at it, the more you start to see that what happened to milk was also happening to the bread, the water, the buildings, the maps, the architecture, and the history itself. Something was being scrubbed clean. Something was being centralized. Something was being hidden. If you want more videos that pull back the curtain on the official story, the kind of history they do not teach in school, hit the subscribe button before you go any further. There is a lot more on this channel that connects to what you are about to see. Now let's get into it. To understand what really happened to the milk supply, you have to go back to a world that most Americans cannot even picture anymore. A world before refrigerated trucks, before grocery stores, before brand names. A world where the food on your table came from less than a mile away. In 1850, the typical American family did not buy milk. They got it from a cow they owned, or from a neighbor down the road, or from a small dairy at the edge of town that delivered fresh in glass bottles every morning before sunrise. The milk was warm when it arrived. It still smelled like the field. It had cream that rose to the top in a thick golden layer that you could spoon off and churn into butter. It contained living enzymes, native bacteria, and a full spectrum of fats and minerals that the human body had been adapted to digest for thousands of years. And here is the part that should make you stop and think. People were not getting sick from this milk. Not in the small towns, not in the rural counties, not on the farms. The disease problem, the one we are told justified the entire pasteurization movement, was almost entirely a city problem. And it was almost entirely a problem in one specific kind of city dairy. They called them swill dairies. And what was happening in them was not a failure of raw milk. It was a deliberate corruption of it. The swill dairies were industrial operations attached to whiskey distilleries in cities like New York, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and Cincinnati. The distilleries produced a waste product called swill, which was the spent grain mash left over after the alcohol was extracted. This swill was hot, fermented, nutrient-stripped, and so corrosive that it ate through wooden troughs. The distilleries did not want to pay to dispose of it, so they built massive cattle sheds next to the stills and pumped the swill straight into feeding troughs. Cows that should have been grazing on grass were locked in dark stalls, some standing in their own waste up to their knees, fed nothing but distillery slop until their teeth fell out and their tails rotted off. There are documented cases of cows so weak they had to be tied upright to be milked because they could no longer stand on their own. The milk that came out of these animals was, of course, deadly. It was thin, blue, and so nutritionally degraded that it had to be cut with chalk, plaster of Paris, starch, eggs, and molasses, just to look like real milk. Children who drank it died by the thousands. In New York City alone, the infant mortality rate from contaminated swill milk was estimated at 60% in some neighborhoods. A reformer named Robert Hartley wrote an entire book about it in 1842, titled An Historical, Scientific and Practical Essay on Milk. He documented the swill dairies in graphic detail. He named the distilleries. He named the politicians who protected them. He named the city inspectors who took bribes to look the other way. He showed that the cows in those sheds had open sores oozing pus into the milk pails. He showed that the milk was being delivered to orphanages and tenement houses, where it was the primary food for infants whose mothers could not nurse. The book caused a scandal. Investigations were launched, headlines were written, and then almost nothing happened. The swill dairies kept operating for another 40 years because the men who owned them were the same men who owned the newspapers, the city council seats, and the tax collectors. What finally closed the swill dairies was not pasteurization and not reform legislation. What closed them was the railroad. Once refrigerated rail cars made it possible to bring fresh country milk into the city in bulk, the swill dairy business model collapsed on its own. The cities did not need pasteurization to fix the swill problem. The swill problem was already fixing itself. And yet, the moment the swill problem started fading, the pasteurization campaign began. That timing is the tell. If pasteurization had really been about the swill dairies, the laws would have come in the 1850s and 1860s when the crisis was at its peak. Instead, the laws came in the 1890s and 1900s, after the crisis had already passed and after the rural milk shed had become a viable competitor to the urban industrialists. The laws were not aimed at the disease. The laws were aimed at the competition. So when the reformers showed up demanding action, they had a real problem to point to. But here is the question nobody was asking out loud. Why was the solution heat treatment of all milk, including the clean raw milk from rural farms that had nothing to do with the swill dairies? Why was the answer not simply to shut down the swill dairies? The answer is because the people pushing pasteurization were not actually trying to solve the swill dairy problem. The swill dairy problem was the cover story. The real goal was something much bigger. The real goal was to get rid of small dairies entirely. Because as long as small dairies existed, the men who wanted to control the milk supply could not control it. And this is where the story stops being about food and starts being about power. By the 1880s, a handful of families in the northeastern United States had begun consolidating dairy processing into massive centralized plants. They had access to capital that small farmers did not have. They had political connections in state legislatures and city councils. They had relationships with the new railroad companies that were laying track across the country at a pace that historians still struggle to fully explain. And they had a problem. Their centralized model could not compete with the small dairy on price, on freshness, or on quality. The only way to make their model work was to make the small dairy illegal. Pasteurization was the weapon. Once a city passed a law requiring all milk sold within its limits to be pasteurized, the small farmer was finished. He could not afford the equipment. He could not afford the inspections. He could not afford the licensing fees. He could not afford the centralized bottling. The only operations that could meet the new requirements were the ones owned by the men who had lobbied for the laws in the first place. Within 20 years, the American dairy landscape had been completely rewritten. Tens of thousands of small dairies were gone. The land was consolidated. The cows were moved into massive industrial feedlots. The milk was shipped hundreds of miles, heated, homogenized, stripped of cream, refortified with synthetic vitamins, and sold back to the same people who used to produce it themselves. And the entire transformation was sold to the public as a triumph of science and public health. Now here is where the story gets strange. Because if you look at the pattern of what happened to milk, you start to notice that the exact same pattern was happening at the exact same time to almost every other staple of American life. Bread is the clearest parallel. In 1850, most Americans ate bread baked locally, often at home, from wheat ground at small water mills using stones that had been quarried out of the local hills. The flour was full of bran, germ, oils, and minerals. By 1910, the entire bread supply had been industrialized. The new roller mills, owned by the same kind of consolidated trust that owned the dairy plants, stripped the wheat of its germ, removed the bran, bleached the flour with chlorine gas, and shipped it across the country in sacks. The bread that came out the other end was white, soft, sweet, and so nutritionally hollow that within a generation Deficiency diseases like pellagra and beriberi exploded across the working class. The solution offered by the same consolidated industries was to spray synthetic vitamins back onto the dead flower and call it enriched. The same playbook, the same pattern, the same outcome. Water is the next parallel. Across America in the late 1800s, every town of any size had its own spring houses, artesian wells, and ice ponds that supplied free, clean, mineral-rich water to the local population. The architecture of these water systems was extraordinary. Massive stone structures with vaulted ceilings, copper piping, mineral filtration through layered sand and charcoal, and elaborate distribution networks of cast iron and lead-glazed clay. Look at the old photographs. The spring houses look like cathedrals. The pump houses look like temples. By 1920, almost all of them had been condemned, demolished, or buried. They were replaced with centralized municipal systems that pumped chlorinated, fluoridated, chemically treated water from distant reservoirs through pipes that nobody could see. The free water became metered water, the local water became distant water, the living water became dead water. And then there are the buildings. This is where the Tartaria question really comes alive. If you walk through any older American city, look at the courthouses, the post offices, the train stations, the banks, the hotels, the universities, the libraries. The level of craftsmanship in these structures is, by modern standards, almost incomprehensible. Hand-carved stone reliefs, domed ceilings frescoed by hand, bronze doorways weighing tons each, spires that catch the light, marble columns quarried from sites that nobody can identify anymore. We are told these buildings were constructed in the late 1800s and early 1900s by immigrant labourers using hand tools, mules, and pulley systems. We are told they were built in 2 or 3 years on budgets that would not even cover the architectural drawings today. And then we are told that within 50 years almost all of them were demolished. The Singer Building, the original Pennsylvania Station, the old Chicago Federal Building, the original Boston City Hall, the old San Francisco Mint, the Philadelphia Public Ledger Building, hundreds of structures of breathtaking beauty and complexity, torn down within living memory, replaced with parking lots, glass boxes, and buildings that will not last 60 years. Pennsylvania Station alone is worth pausing on. Built in 1910 by the firm of McKim, Mead and White, it covered 8 acres in Midtown Manhattan. The main waiting room was modelled on the baths of Caracalla, with vaulted ceilings rising 150 feet above the floor. The columns were solid pink granite, 22 tons each, quarried in Massachusetts and shipped down by barge. The entrance hall was lit by enormous lunette windows of leaded glass that filled the space with a soft, almost cathedral light. Visitors who walked into it for the first time often stopped and wept. Demolition began in 1963. Within 3 years, the entire structure was rubble, sold for fill dirt, and used to drown a swamp in New Jersey. The official explanation was that the railroads no longer needed it. The actual reason was that the land underneath was worth more empty than full, and the men who owned the railroads had long since stopped caring about the public face of the cities they had built. This was not an isolated incident. It was a national policy. Between 1950 and 1980, in a campaign called Urban Renewal, more than 2,000 of America's most architecturally significant buildings were demolished, most of them with federal funds. The wrecking ball swung in every major city. St. Louis lost its old courthouses. Detroit lost its grand hotels. Cincinnati lost its riverfront temples. Cleveland lost its arcades. Buffalo lost the original Larkin building designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, demolished in 1950 to make a parking lot that is still half empty. The pattern is so consistent that it cannot be explained by any single market force. Something else was driving it. Why? The official answers do not hold up under scrutiny. Modernization, cost, safety, none of these explain the scale or the speed of the demolition. The buildings were paid for. They were structurally sound. Many of them were less than 100 years old, and yet they were erased with a fury that almost feels personal. This is what the Tartaria researchers are pointing at. not necessarily a lost continent, not necessarily a hidden empire with that exact name, but a pattern of erasure, a pattern in which the older, more advanced, more decentralized, more beautiful version of America was systematically replaced with a newer, simpler, more controlled, more centralized version. And the public was told a story about progress that, when you look at it closely, does not actually fit the evidence. Milk fits this pattern perfectly. The old way was decentralized, the new way is centralized. The old way was nourishing, the new way is hollow. The old way connected the eater to the land. The new way places a corporate intermediary between the eater and everything that feeds him. The old way was free or nearly free. The new way costs money and generates profit for a small number of owners. The old way did not require permission. The new way requires permission at every step. And once you see this pattern, you start to see it everywhere. Consider the world's fairs. Between 1851 and 1915, a series of vast exhibitions were staged in cities like London, Paris, Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco, and Buffalo. The structures built for these fairs are some of the most extraordinary in human history. The 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, called the White City, covered over 600 acres and contained more than 200 buildings of pure neoclassical architecture, lit by electric light at a scale that was supposedly impossible for the era. Visitors who walked through it described it as a glimpse of a civilization beyond their own. And then, within a year of the fair closing, almost every building was demolished. The official explanation is that they were temporary structures made of staff, a kind of plaster. The photographs and engineering drawings tell a different story. Massive domes, carved stone facades, statuary that took years to design, machinery exhibits that displayed technology nobody can quite explain. The pattern is the same. Build something extraordinary, display it briefly, burn it down, move on, tell the children it was always temporary, tell them the new world is better. By 1900, the same families that controlled the dairy trusts also controlled the railroad consolidations, the steel cartels, the oil monopolies, the banking syndicates, and increasingly the universities and the medical boards. When Abraham Flexner published his report on American medical education in 1910, dozens of small colleges of homeopathy, eclectic medicine, naturopathy, and traditional botanical practice were declared substandard and shut down. The funding came from the same foundations that funded the pasteurization studies. The result was the same. Decentralized knowledge replaced with centralized authority. Local practice replaced with corporate practice. Living tradition replaced with licensed institution. And just as raw milk was demonized as dangerous, so was the herbalist, the midwife, the lay healer, the country doctor with his black bag full of plant tinctures. By 1925, almost all of them were gone or driven underground. The new medicine, like the new milk, came in sterile bottles, manufactured in distant plants, dispensed by certified intermediaries and protected by laws that made any alternative a criminal act. This is the deeper story under the milk story. The milk was just the canary. What happened to the milk happened to the medicine, the architecture, the food, the water, the schools, the maps, and the historical record itself. And here is what makes it almost impossible to talk about openly. The men who orchestrated the transition were not stupid. They were brilliant. They understood that if you want to replace one civilization with another, you cannot do it in a single generation. You have to do it slowly. You have to do it with cover stories. You have to give people a reason to celebrate the loss. You have to make them grateful for the chains. You tell them the old way was dirty. You tell them the old way was unsafe. You tell them the old way was primitive. You tell them science has saved them. And by the time the children of that generation grow up, they cannot even imagine the world their grandparents lived in. Ask any American under 50 to describe what raw milk tastes like. Most cannot. They have never tasted it. It is illegal in most states to sell across state lines. It is illegal in many states to sell at all. In some states, you can be arrested and your farm destroyed for giving raw milk to a neighbor. The law treats a glass of milk the way it treats a controlled narcotic, and almost nobody asks why. In 2011, federal agents raided an Amish dairy farm in Pennsylvania at 5 a.m. with guns drawn because the farmer had shipped a few gallons of raw milk to private buyers across the state line. In 2010, a Wisconsin farmer named Vernon Hirschberger was prosecuted for the crime of selling raw milk to members of a private buying club. In 2006, a small dairy in Ohio was shut down and its herd dispersed because the owner refused to pasteurize. These stories do not make the national news. They appear briefly in local papers and then disappear. But they are happening year after year, and they are happening for one reason. The system that was built in 1910 still has to be defended in 2026 because the people who profit from it still profit, and the people who lose from it still lose. The official answer is still the same one from 1910. Disease, safety, children. But the actual data tells a very different story. According to the Centers for Disease Control's own records, raw milk causes a tiny fraction of foodborne illness compared to commercial leafy greens, deli meats, factory eggs, and pasteurized soft cheeses. The risk has been measured, and it is statistically negligible compared to almost every other food on the modern American shelf, yet the legal regime treats it the way it would treat poison. Why? Because the legal regime was never about safety. The legal regime was about market control. And once a market control regime is in place, it tends to stay in place long after the original justification has dissolved, because the people who profit from it have no interest in letting it go. Every generation, the cover story is updated. Every generation, the public is told the same thing in slightly different words. And every generation, the actual history of what was lost gets harder to find. This is the pattern that makes Tartaria, as a research lens, so unsettling. It is not really a claim about a specific empire or a specific date. It is a claim about a pattern of forgetting, a claim that we are living inside a managed historical narrative, and that the real history is not gone, it is just buried. Buried under demolished buildings, buried under reissued textbooks, buried under industrial food, buried under processed information, buried under a deliberate fog that makes it almost impossible for the average person to see what was taken from them. Pasteurization is one small thread of this pattern, but once you pull the thread, the whole tapestry starts to come loose. Think about it this way. A glass of fresh raw milk from a grass-fed cow contains live enzymes, beneficial bacteria, butyrate, conjugated linoleic acid, vitamin K2, full-spectrum fats, and bioavailable calcium in a form the body recognizes from 100,000 years of human evolution. A glass of pasteurized, homogenized industrial milk contains denatured proteins, oxidized fats, dead enzymes, residual antibiotics, hormone traces, and a bleached white liquid that would have been unrecognizable to any human being who lived before 1900. We are told the second is the safe version. We are told the first is the dangerous version. And almost no one stops to ask whether the labels have been switched. The same trick was performed on bread. The same trick was performed on butter. The same trick was performed on cooking oils when traditional fats like tallow, lard, and butter were demonized in favor of industrial seed oils manufactured by chemical extraction. The same trick was performed on salt when natural mineral salt was replaced with chemically refined sodium chloride. The same trick again and again and again. Take the living thing, kill it, refine it, standardize it, centralize its production, make the natural version illegal or impossible to find, and tell the public that what they have lost was never any good in the first place. And here is the strangest part of all. The men who did this did not hide their intentions. They wrote about them openly in their own publications. The agricultural journals of the early 1900s are full of explicit discussions about the need to consolidate dairy production, eliminate the small farmer, and bring the food supply under scientific management. The medical journals of the same period openly celebrate the closure of competing schools and the centralization of authority under a single licensing body. The architectural journals of the 1920s and 1930s mock the old buildings as embarrassing relics and call for their replacement with modern functional machine for living style structures. The record is there. It is just not taught. This is why the Tartaria question matters even if you reject every specific claim associated with it. Because the underlying observation that an older, more decentralized, more beautiful, more nourishing version of the world was deliberately and systematically replaced with a newer, more controlled, more hollow version is not a fringe claim. It is documentable in the public record. The dairy story documents it. The bread story documents it. The water story documents it. The architecture story documents it. The medicine story documents it. The pattern repeats so consistently across so many domains that the only real question is who benefited from the replacement, and what did they do with the power they gained. That question is harder to answer. The trail of beneficiaries leads through a small number of family fortunes, foundations, and trusts that consolidated their grip on American institutional life between roughly 1880 and 1930. The names are familiar to anyone who has studied the period closely. They funded the universities that wrote the new histories. They funded the foundations that wrote the new health standards. They funded the publishing houses that decided which books would be reprinted and which would be allowed to go out of print. They funded the new medical schools and the new agricultural colleges and the new public health departments. And the world that emerged from their efforts looked very different from the world that existed before they started. The world before was strange and various and uneven. It had real problems, real diseases, real injustices, real poverty. Nobody is arguing that the past was a paradise. The argument is something more specific. The argument is that the cure imposed on those problems was, in many cases, worse than the disease. And the cure was imposed not by the communities affected, but by a small number of distant interests who happened to profit from the imposition. You can see this most clearly in milk, because milk is so simple. A cow eats grass, a cow gives milk, a child drinks milk. This is one of the oldest and most universal human food relationships on earth. It does not require a factory. It does not require a license. It does not require a chemist. It does not require a federal regulation. The fact that this simplest of all human foods has been buried under 100 years of legal, scientific, and commercial machinery should tell you everything you need to know about how thoroughly the modern food system has been engineered to insert intermediaries between the eater and the eaten. Once you see it in milk, you start to see it everywhere. The intermediary is the product, the intermediary is the goal. The intermediary is what the entire system was built to create, and the natural, direct, unmediated relationship between human beings and the things that nourish them is what the system was built to destroy. This is why people who learn the real history of pasteurization rarely stop at milk. The questions keep going. If they lied about milk, what else did they lie about? If the story of why we pasteurize turned out to be a cover for something else, what other stories are also covers? The school version of history starts to feel thinner. The official version of medicine starts to feel less reliable. The mainstream version of architecture, of agriculture, of nutrition, of public health, all of it starts to feel less neutral and more curated, less natural and more managed. This is the doorway. This is why the Tartaria conversation refuses to die, no matter how many times mainstream commentators ridicule it. It is not because people are stupid. It is because the official story has too many holes. And once you see the holes in one place, you cannot stop seeing them everywhere else. The milk hole is one of the easiest to spot because the documentation is still there if you know where to look. The agricultural records, the infant mortality data, the lobbying records, the corporate filings, the architectural photographs, the before and after images of the cities, the legal histories of the licensing acts, the personal letters of the men who wrote the laws, it is all there. It just is not in the textbooks. So the next time you walk into a grocery store and see a wall of identical white cartons of milk, all from the same handful of corporations, all processed in the same handful of plants, all stripped and standardized and sterilized, take a moment to consider what is not on the shelf. Consider the millions of small dairies that used to dot the American landscape. Consider the millions of children who used to grow up drinking living milk from a cow they could see with their own eyes. Consider the architecture of the old city dairies, the marble-floored milk houses with their copper vats and their stained glass windows, every one of them now demolished or converted into something else. Consider what the country was, and what was done to it, and ask yourself who decided. And then ask yourself what else, on what other shelves, in what other parts of your life, was once different. What was once free? What was once local? What was once beautiful? What was once yours? The milk is just where the thread starts. The story is much, much bigger than the milk. If this video opened up questions you have never been allowed to ask, you are not alone. There are millions of Americans waking up to the same pattern, in the same week, in the same country. The information is out there. The records exist. The buildings still exist in old photographs. The maps still exist in old archives. The history is recoverable, but only if enough people are willing to look. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to see it, and keep asking questions. Because the truth about the milk is just the beginning.